I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 103 of EO Radio Show. This is our 16th in the series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on the state filings in Nevada, Arizona, Washington State and Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico and Utah, Colorado and Wyoming, and most recently, Washington, D.C. With the help of Joe Hilliard today, I'm going to look at basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in Michigan and Ohio. If you didn't hear your state in the list I just read, stay tuned for future episodes. We're going to cover them all. And if you did hear your state and you want to go back to that episode, you can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there is a playlist that organizes just the state filing requirements, so you don't have to wade through all 102 of the earlier episodes. So stay tuned as we work our way through the rest of the states, and today we're talking about Michigan and Ohio. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world, because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. So today, as we review the state laws in Michigan and Ohio for incorporating nonprofit corporations, I'm really happy to welcome back Joe Hilliard. Glad to see you again, Joe.
It's good to be back here again.
We thought that since this is a good month for college football, it's when we all get immersed in it if you're a football fan. We thought this was a good time to start with two of the powerhouse states in a rather fabled rivalry, Michigan and Ohio. But before we get into the unique features in those states, let's start with an update of the laws on the states we've already covered. So, Joe, anything to remind our listeners of on that front?
So as we come in, there hasn't been any updates on the states we haven't covered, but as we go into the rivalries today, Ohio actually has put in some changes even as we were talking and I was doing my research. So in July of 2024, to be effective just last week, October 24th, 2024, Ohio amended the nonprofit corporation law regarding dissolutions and the duties of directors. Those are items outside our normal scope that we discuss here, but as our ongoing and winding down nonprofits in Ohio, this should be understood. The dissolution language was a lot more strict now in terms of getting out of the state. So a link to that updated bill that was signed is going to be in the show notes. So we'll talk about that then too.
So that's a good reminder. What we focus on in these episodes is primarily administrative details on how to actually navigate the filing systems to create and stay in compliance as a nonprofit corporations. But there is state law on corporation operations and the things that apply at the state law level. So those are really important to check from time to time, too. Sometimes the websites don't get updated on the administrative front quite as quickly as the laws are changing. So with that little teaser on being sure to check things that are changing, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program, starting with our favorite Midwestern state, which is
Michigan. As an alum from a few years back, I'm kind of sad that they're not doing that great this year, but still basking in the national championship from last year. So it's nice to see them still out there.
Yeah, Michigan's dear to my heart as well. My husband and one of my sons graduated from University of Michigan. So let's focus a little bit on Michigan's Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. I gather they're our division that governs the entity formation.
Yes, that is correct. They don't really have Secretary of States per se there. They're done through their different departments, and within their corporations division specifically, they have a Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. Then for them, for a domestic nonprofit corporation, they do have a form Articles of Incorporation, and the state actually also gives you a separate PDF of instructions. So there's a couple documents that'll be in the show notes that are easy to pull down. It's a 4-page document, asks for a lot of our basics, the name, who your registered agent in Michigan will be. And always, though, it has some state-specific quirks. Their Article 2 is the purpose for the nonprofit, and we've been over that before. But again, make sure that you've got that where you feel very comfortable with it. Article 3 is very different. It asks if the nonprofit is a stock or non-stock And then if it's choosing the non-stock, it asks further for a, quote, description and value of its real property assets, unquote. And then also a description and value of its personal property assets. Both of these can be noted as none on the form, but then it asks how the nonprofit will be financed under a general plan, and you have to fill in a general plan. So you have to have an idea of where, as a private foundation, I guess, how your money is going to be coming in, and if it's going to be a public charity, how you're going to do that. So it's a little similar to some things you have in a 1023, but again, this is something to think about specifically when you're registering. It's slightly different. Then lastly, Article 3 asks whether the nonprofit was formed on a membership or directorship basis. Again, that's not necessarily wording we're used to, but obviously most of ours are formed on a directorship basis. And then we would talk about that. Then Article 5 is for your name and address of the incorporators. They will then sign on the next page. The addresses can be a business or residential, and only an educational nonprofit requires 3 incorporators. All other nonprofits need to have only 1 incorporator. So again, that's kind of unusual depending on what your purpose is, determines how many people will sign off on your document. Just prior to the signature page, there's an almost full page blank form for additional articles. This is where our 501c3 dissolution language could be added. Again, this is important to keep in mind and have that in place so there's no issues when you dissolve. There's no article specific to the nonprofit's address, but the top of the form has a return to address section. If it's not completed, the filed copy of your document will simply go to your registered agent.
So what about foreign nonprofits that want to operate in Michigan? How do they come into compliance and qualify to transact business in Michigan?
As we've seen in some of our other states, Michigan has what they call an application for certificate of authority to transact business or conduct affairs in Michigan. And this covers both profit and nonprofit corporations. Again, we've seen that in several other states. Very straightforward and asks for the basics of all your foreign registrations: name, where formed, the address, your Michigan registered agent. Section 6 does ask for the specific business or affairs of which the corporation is to transact or conduct in Michigan. And so this would be your purpose from your nonprofit. But that's really the only thing that stands out on that. Otherwise, it's basic. And yes, as we've talked about it, you will need a good standing from your state of formation to attach to this as well.
So what does it cost to make these filings, and how quick is the turnaround time?
So for both of the domestic and the foreign, it's only $20 to file. They do have a markdown for their nonprofits, as many of the states do, so that's good. And while the state itself does not list a processing time on its website, research with my filing service has indicated it's 2 to 3 business days online and 10 to 15 business days for mail filings. With that, the state does allow for expedited services. These are lower for initial formation documents than they are for existing entities, which was interesting. But the 24-hour expedite is $50. A same day is $100. A 2-hour, as long as you file it before 3 p.m. Eastern, is $500. And it's for a 1 hour, as long as you file before 4 p.m. Eastern, is $1,000 added on to that. So it adds up really quick. And remember, even though, as we discussed this, Michigan is a Midwestern state, they still are on Eastern time, not Central time. So it's for us in California, it's still 3 hours to call our relatives back there.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't seen $1,000 for an hour filing. That's, on one hand, that's a lot of money, but on the other hand, do something where they needed it processed in an hour.
Right. This is somebody that's doing it on December 30th and said, oh my God, I need it this year.
I guess so. Really down to the wire.
Yes.
Well, anyway, it's nice to see that it's an option. I don't know that we've seen another state where you could actually get something filed within an hour. So make a mental note of that. So what about annual filings? What do we file with the state annually in Michigan?
So in Michigan, annual reports for nonprofits, both the domestic and the foreign, are due on or before October 1st of each year following the year of incorporation. So if we form now in November 2024, our first report would be due October 1st, 2025. If we form in January of 2025, a couple months from now, our report would not be due until October 1st, 2026. So kind of a little bit of math there, but not too bad. These reports do need to include the name and addresses of all the officers and directors.
All right. And annual online fees?
They can be filed online. Yes, the annual here can be filed online. We talk about that. Very few states do not offer that nowadays. Most states want your annual reports online. And here again, it's the same as when you did your formation, and same for foreign and domestic. It's $20.
So transparency and privacy, the flip sides in Michigan, how much detail about personal information has to be filed with their department?
So as we noted with the articles, there's not really anything. The incorporator needs to name and have an address, but it can be a business address. And then once you get into the annual reports, as you go down the line, your officers and directors need to be named. But again, that can just be a business address. So.
Oh, great. That's always nice to see. Any other state agencies in Michigan that our nonprofit needs to file with?
For sure. So in Michigan, if the nonprofit is organized there in the state, or it's a foreign that's soliciting, holding assets, or doing business there in Michigan, you will be required to file a registration with the Attorney General's Charitable Trust section. And just like annual reports, again, like California here too, where you have an RRF1, the Attorney General does ask for an annual report as well, which will, as I recall, it has your information from your 990 on it. I don't believe this one had to actually attach your 990, but you do have to provide some of your financial information along with that.
All right. So some real state supervision there. What about income tax in Michigan?
For sure. So the Department of Treasury no longer has an application process for tax exemptions from the Michigan sales and use tax for nonprofits. Organizations are exempted by statute, and then as long as they've got their 501c3 letter or they've got a previous from the Michigan Department of Treasury, they can get the exemption. If not, a copy of your federal exemption letter or letter will accompany a completed sales and tax certificate of exemption. So links can be found in the show notes. It was rather strange. They've kind of grandfathered in older people, and they've changed the process in the last year or two to let you get in. But there is some, do check the show notes, do check the sales and tax Department of Treasury link so that you can follow through.
So that was sales and use tax. I gather there's not an income tax or an income tax exemption process for nonprofits in Michigan?
Not that I was able to locate.
Interesting. Okay, well, good. So moving on from Michigan, let's talk a little bit about Ohio, and considering links back to that state as well. I lived in Ohio as a child, so I have some fondness for that state. I'm guessing those who are true Michigan fans don't have anything kind to say about Ohio, but we'll, set that aside and give them their due here. I
do have some family that, as my Michigan relatives call it, Cleveland, not Cleveland, and a couple in Toledo. So I have my connections there as well.
All right. So let's talk about the lovely state of Ohio.
For sure.
What do we need to do to file a new nonprofit corporation in Ohio?
So here they do. It is the Secretary of State that governs Ohio formations. It's more of a normalized system there. They have a 3-page initial articles of incorporation form that they just updated actually in October of 24. I presume this goes again with the changes that we talked about at the beginning with the dissolution and with the changes in directorship that they put in place. We do have our usual suspects, the name, the address, your registered agent. The third article is their purpose article. Again, follow through with keeping that in line with what you've told the IRS. There's also a note under the third article which says, quote, allows for additional provisions to be included in the articles of incorporation that are filed with this office. If including any of these additional provisions, please do so by including them in an attachment to this form, unquote. So you can add a page when you file, and this would be where we would put our 501c3 dissolution language. We only have one incorporator that needs to sign here, and there wasn't any real address issues with them. It was just sign off on.
Okay, cool. That's easy. And what about our foreign nonprofit corporation?
So foreign, we'll talk about as you get into this, you'll see that it's a little more complex here. So they do have a form, a foreign nonprofit corporation application for license will need to be filed. It's also a 3-page form. It's got your basics, the name, the address, the purpose, your registered agent, and your home state. It does ask if the entity is registering solely to enable the nonprofit to prosecute or defend a legal action, which is unusual. We don't see that. And if you say yes to that, there actually is an additional fee to the process. So if you're just coming in to sue people, you have to pay more in Ohio. It also asks whether the nonprofit was transacting business in Ohio prior to 2009, and if so, there would be additional paperwork. Considering that's 15 years ago, I would hope that you weren't, but that's still it's very specific in the form that year. And then most crucially here, and this is the biggest thing, something we have not seen, as I recall, any of the states, is an officer has to sign off and their signature has to be notarized on this.
Wow, that's annoying.
And we did. I did file an Ohio registration for a nonprofit back in 2022. And I can attest, because I had people across the country, I crossed my fingers and talked to the state, and they were very, very adamant that no, this was part of it. It took us a few extra days to get us registered than we had anticipated. And again, it was actually a nonprofit based in Cincinnati, so it was a big deal to do this. We did it in Delaware just for those certain protections that we've often talked about, and then wanted to put it into Ohio. And it took us almost 2 weeks longer than we had anticipated to get us registered in Ohio with this. So be mindful if you're registering as a foreign nonprofit in Ohio that you really need to have a real live person signing and getting their notary. So
Okay, something new today. Setting aside those unusual circumstances, what's the usual turnaround time for filings if we've got our notary arranged already?
So once you have all your papers in a row, for their Ohio website, normal filing time is 3 to 7 business days. They have several expedite options as well. 2 business days is 100, 1 business day is 200, and then 4 hours. Again, if it's before 1 p.m., it's $300. The last one there, the 4-hour one, does need to be an in-person filing. So you have to find someone either in-state or use a service to take your copy to the desk. And the cost there for both the domestic and the foreign is $99, the base cost.
All right. So what about annual filings? Is there an annual report to the state?
So again, this is going to be very unusual. For domestic and foreign nonprofits, there's no annual report due per se. However, if you filed no other documents with the state within 5 years, like if you've done an amendment to change your address stuff, if you haven't done that, then you need to file a statement of continued existence. And again, that's after 5 years. It will include the name, address, and the agent. Must be signed by an officer or director, or if you are a member nonprofit, then at least 3 of members would have to sign. This Form 2 was updated in October of 2024. It's a $25 fee irrespective of domestic or foreign. With that one, again, it's kind of one of those weird things where we talk about calendaring and reminding once you formed it to put a 5-year notice, because that's a long time out. I would say the only thing comparable is like fictitious business names here in California is the only other thing I've really got that's on a 5-year that I can think of off the top of my head. So it's one to really be aware of and not let slide. As we talk about, if you don't have that registration, then it affects obviously your donations and your grant making both, depending on what you're doing. So,
and I see the fee for that is not particularly difficult.
No, it's not, and it is. This also is an online form that you can do too. It's just one of those things where you've got to remember to do it. Again, I haven't had one. The last one I did was in 2022, so I haven't got my notice, to see if they actually give me a notice in 2027. When we're recording in 2027, you and I will report back on Ohio. I'll put a note in my calendar to talk about.
Yeah, and hopefully we've calendared that date in 2027 for our existing clients. So that's
we did definitely, because it was so strange. That's why as soon as I went into Ohio, I was like, I remember this.
Yeah, how about that? Well, I've learned something new today. Apparently you knew this already, but wow, 5 years, that's like way so far in the future. So our transparency and privacy in Ohio, how much detail are we giving?
So as we noted, the foreign authority, when you initially sign up, needs to be signed and notarized by an officer director, and an officer director signs the 5-year statement. But other than that, there's not a lot of visibility. It's pretty much private. And
what about the other state agencies? Supervision by the state on the charity front?
On the charity front, so if you organize there, or if you're foreign that's soliciting, holding assets, you need to file registration with the Attorney General's Charitable Trust section here. They do have an annual report as well. And additionally, a nonprofit organization may be subject to charitable solicitation reporting regulations in a particular city. The Attorney General particularly calls that out. They may be required to obtain a permit in order to solicit contributions from the public and to report that contribution received and expenses occurred directly to the city. So it's really advisable to consult someone that perhaps that's in the city that has a local Ohio connection to make sure you're not missing anything there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Annual filings?
There is an annual report there as well, too. For your corporate and sales tax exemptions and income tax both, they need to apply through the Ohio's Department of Taxation, and all the links are to both of those in the bottom.
All right. So that's great. That's been a really interesting survey for those of us who geek out on this sort of stuff for Michigan and Ohio. And that wraps us up for this episode. Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate your research and filling us in on all these details.
For sure.
So be sure to check out the show notes, like we said, for links to the resources in Michigan and Ohio, and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. As a reminder, if you go back to earlier episodes for the states we've already covered, be sure to check into updated laws before looking at filing or even doing your annual report in the state. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Farella, Braun, and Martel has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including the one we are building where all the state filing episodes are in one place. So look for that link in the show notes as well. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.